So I'm going to try and give. I mean, it's just a lot, but I'm going to try and give you at least some um, of kind of a basic, at least a basic framework. I don't know if you had a chance to look at John Paul II's letter to artists. It's really a beautiful letter, um, and also the talk by Bishop Barron is quite good, huh? Um, my presentation is not going to be as good as his, but I have a few things, and hopefully it will be helpful to you. I think just a quick gloss on some of the I think key points with John Paul II's letter I thought were important takeaways. He talks about basically that an artist is not a creator in the sense that none of us create ex nihilo like God does, right? We don't create something from nothing. We all start with something, and then we collaborate with it, we cooperate with it to make it into, John Paul II says that this is part of this mandate we receive in Genesis, right? To go and have dominion over the earth. He says that, well, that means that you are to help bring beauty out of the earth and to bring beauty into existence more fully. So God's creative work continues, if you will, through us in our collaboration, insofar as we engage in creative work. And I think what's really and so he talks about how in doing so we not only are glorifying God and giving it's not only God who is revealed, but there's also we're personally invested in it. So there's also a certain degree of ourselves that is revealed too. And there's a balance, right? And I think he expresses concern, that in the kind of contemporary or modern, postmodern world, there's been this move toward kind of a severing from the transcendent and a move away from the sense of giving glory to God. And it's really become, in many ways, art, kind of this raw self-expression and really detached from God, but also detached from any history. So not looking to, you don't see really schools of art in the sense of that you would have seen in earlier time, where people spent years and years and years just trying to mimic or duplicate what masters had done before and to learn from them. And then if they got to the place where they could actually do what their teachers did, then they would move and try and move the ball forward. But now it's kind of like everybody wants to be kind of start ex nihilo. Everyone wants to be their own God and just create something from nothing, rather than receiving that sense of receptivity in the arts. I think that he emphasizes is really important. We're hopefully not seeing ourselves as just starting from scratch. But we really are taking what we've received and then trying to do what we can to add to it and bring it a little bit closer to the beautiful. Of course, never getting there fully, right? So I think that's and I also think an area that he talks about is how Christians in particular, right? So this is if you think about in Judaism before and Islam after, there's a kind of a ban against depicting the sacred in art. And we would, that makes sense in some ways, that you would not try to depict the ineffable divinity of God, were it not for the incarnation. And he talks about this, the incarnational nature of our faith, making Christianity particularly fertile for creativity. Because since God has become flesh, beauty has, in a sense, become flesh. And so we are liberated and empowered to incarnate beauty in a different, we see value and meaning in that in a way that, and we see that as a kind of a participation in God's work of making beauty incarnate, i.e. Jesus, right? The eternal Logos is beautiful, becoming flesh. Well, in a sense, John Paul II says that's every artist, whether he knows it or not, or she knows it or not, is collaborating with and participating in this enfleshment, or this making, putting tangible reality to what otherwise would be entirely beyond our ability to translate into the senses, right? In a sense, in a way, the creative almost, when something's really beautiful, it moves beyond the senses. It surpasses just a mere kind of sensory experience. That's what there's can be almost like this kind of, you walk into this beautiful church, or you hear this beautiful piece of music, you see a beautiful work of art, and it's awe-inspiring. Awe is not merely a physiological response. We have the sense that we're encountering something or someone beyond the particular work of art that might be before us. One of the things my brother talked about in the past, he didn't bring it up last week, maybe he didn't have time, but he was asking, and I'll just briefly touch on it, but he did a lot of thinking about beauty and about, we've had conversations about this late in the evening, sometimes with a scotch. But one of the things that he was saying was like, when you experience something really beautiful, if it's really, really beautiful, sometimes it makes you want to cry. Which is a very odd response when you think about it. So the question was, well, why would beauty make you want to cry? And he was reflecting on that, and he said, well, is it because you're so happy it brings you to tears? But it's like, no, there is a kind of longing, and there's something about beauty that awakens within us this desire and longing for the eternal, and that there is a kind of wounding, is what he talked about. It's like we're kind of wounded almost by beauty, that it opens our hearts to this longing that we have for God, and also a longing to become fully who God made us to be. And there's a kind of sorrow in that, like we're like an aching for that an encounter with something truly beautiful kind of lifts the veil on that. I thought that was quite insightful, but so the artist is really, insofar as the artist tries to bring beauty into the world, he or she is collaborating then with this revelation of God that can evoke a very profound response in the human person, right? So John Paul II says the church needs artists. Church needs artists. And artists need the church. Right. And he's at work to repair some of the art schools these days are not known for being religious centers. Right? There's been a fracture. You go to a music school, an art school, there's been a fracture, and a lot of that has to do with the sense of the artistic community just wanting to be liberated from structures that were considered oppressive to the expression of the art. But it's interesting. I think there's been a shift, and I'm hopeful. We've been it wasn't just like the 60s either. Like, we started doing wacky art. I mean, Picasso is he hasn't been around for a while, right? Pollock is not, that's a long time ago. These are artists who are doing things, this has been at least a century. At this point, the things have been kind of veering off in a rather strange direction. I remember going to the Museum of Modern Art in Washington, D.C. Back when I was in college, and walked in to a room. It was this whole exhibit, and there was this huge, it was probably this big square marble, just a hunk of marble, white marble. And across the whole surface of the marble was milk. And the work of art, the curators every day had to go and pour the milk on the top of the stone so it would get right to the edge, but the surface tension wouldn't let the milk spill over. And that was this exhibit. Interesting. I mean, it's kind of cool. But I was like, and I don't know, you see now where if you go to art school, there's like this much is about the art now in your training, and it's like this much is about giving your rationale and what this means to you. And the milk signifies this, and this means that, and this means this. And if you turn it 3 times, and like there's no, so it has become this weird intellectual exercise where you don't even understand the art by looking at it. It's like, it's only beautiful if you read a 5-page thing. It's like, well, okay. That's an intellectual kind of beauty, maybe. But it's a different thing from the kind of immediacy of something that when you see it, it just draws you right in. And you don't need anybody to sit there and explain it to you. It explains itself. But we're a ways from that. It's hard. There's a lot of art that it really makes no sense unless you had somebody right there telling you about it, and then even then, it doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes. I won't even tell you about some of the other weird stuff. Like, I don't even know. Some of that whole exhibit was like, what in the world is going on here? And how much did they pay this person? So, we're trying to heal that, and there's some good stuff happening, though. I think there's a real renewed interest in beauty. Not just art as self-expression or kind of like, I don't know, a lot of it can get really tied up with vanity and ego and making a name for yourself. And instead of just, then I don't know if when you hopefully read the little biography from Catholic Encyclopedia, it was just a nice summary of his life, but he was unassuming. And he was helping, he had been helped, and he saw himself as part of a tradition that was in service to the church and to God first and foremost, and to the whole of society. And to be an artist was to be a person of service, a noble service. And it was understood that way in the community. It wasn't that you were out there trying to make a name for yourself. It was that you were providing something that was very precious and important and good to the world, and doing it for the glory of God. So, what I appreciate about the letter to artists too is that if you notice, the Pope does a little historic survey, right? I mean, it's abbreviated, and so I thought we might kind of do a similar kind of thing ourselves. So I want to look at, briefly, kind of start going through. They title it kind of the origins. So the early church prior to the Edict of Milan and Christianity becoming legal. Then we have the early Middle Ages, or we could call it you could call it the early Middle Ages, the patristic period. He talks about the Middle Ages. You could kind of call it patristic. Then late Middle Ages, so to about 1000. Then the late Middle Ages, then the early Renaissance, late Renaissance, and then modern. I don't have too much there, but some various things. This is the Duomo in Siena, the cathedral in Siena, Italy. So, this is one of the first Christian works of art. Do you see what it is?
Fish and bread.
Yeah, bread and loaves and fish. Loaves and fish. You'll find the first Christian works of art were covert. And they were often, in some ways, they would use even like pagan symbols, but change something a little bit so that Christians could tell that they were referring to Jesus. But a lot of the art is found in catacombs. We can't really. The early Christians were worshiping in house churches. So there's an ancient ruin that they found, I believe in Turkey or Syria, the Dura Europos church. It's about 3rd century, so 200s. And there's imagery they found in tile work and other things that indicate that it was used as a church, this kind of house. And so we have an idea. So you can see here we have an assembly room, so the main nave of the church where people gather, a teaching area, courtyard, and baptistry. So, pretty good design as far as I'm concerned. Place for the Lord's Supper, place to teach, place to baptize, place to hang out. And now, I'm sure, what basically happened was if you had wealthier parishioners, they would have, that had larger estates or bigger homes, they would turn them over to be used for sacred purposes by the early church community. And what started to happen is they would also, obviously, start to decorate them a little bit here and there. And then the other main area but a lot of those were not preserved. We just don't have that art. It was not preserved. Where we have, it's interesting, the catacombs. The catacombs, because they were abandoned. Well, first of all, they were subterranean, and then they were abandoned for a century. And so there's some preserved art in the catacombs that you can find. This is the catacombs of St. Marcellinus and Peter. And you can see there, you get after you, like, I've been through a lot of Roman catacombs, and you can see early kind of this primitive Christian art. It's actually really endearing. It's really beautiful. But I think, as far as I read, this is, I believe, see, that's Our Lady and Jesus. This is depicting the Magi visiting our Lord, the Magi. And I'd have to read the description of it again. But this is actually, so this would have been a burial. That's a burial niche. That's a burial niche. These are burial niches. This is in a catacomb. This is one of the earliest depictions of our Lord that we know of in the Roman catacombs. So this is our Lord healing the woman who touched the tassel. Right? So this is probably about 300, 350, something like that. It's very common in the early church. You don't see crucifixes really until 6th century. It was a scandal. It was really, they still were crucifying people, so you knew what that was like, and you didn't want to see it. You see depictions of Christ as a good shepherd. And there are a lot of different good shepherds images of Jesus around in different catacombs and in early Christian art. And here we get to see, that's the goat. Right in the corner. So he's got the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And a couple ducks. I don't know where they are. I don't know what happens to the ducks. You also, so the sarcophagus this would have been a marble cover that was put over the niche in a catacomb. This one would have been, so that's the name of the person. Actually, I take that back. I don't know. I'm not sure what that is. This I do know. That's the three wise men. Right? With St. Joseph and Our Lady and our Lord bringing their gifts. Again, 3rd century. This would have not been like you're not sitting there in your art shop making a bunch of Christian stuff, because that would get you taken out. So this is like, late at night, carving something. You're not like, so it's, and a lot of, who knows, right? There might have been a ton, there probably was a ton more that was created that was either destroyed during the persecutions or has been lost over the centuries. This is a marble sarcophagus. You can see now dating around 375 to 400. This is post Constantine. So now we start to see that we can actually do art a little more freely. So you start to see a little bit more going on. So here we have the 12 sheep, Jesus in the middle, and we've got the description I read, so you can find Peter and Paul somewhere here. I don't know, but these are the apostles on either side. There are a lot of beautifully carved marble sarcophagus that are still in Rome or in that area that are really neat. There's some that have different scenes depicting different. One of the cool things too, if you look in the back of our cathedral, we have some really beautiful marble reliefs that are quite well done. So, all right. So I think when you look at early Christian art, it was really pretty. It was pretty primitive, but it was also there's kind of a beauty. There's a beauty to it, a simplicity. A lot changed after Constantine became, Constantine made it, lifted the persecution on Christians. Not only did he do that, but he also gave Christians some of the state buildings in Rome at the time. He gave them the Basilica of St. John Lateran, which was like a courthouse. It was a kind of a court building. And so Christians then started to use these large kind of civil buildings and to repurpose them as churches. They also took pagan temples that eventually, in the coming centuries, paganism basically, it was out of favor, although there were remnants of pagan practice and religious observance that battled it out and took sometimes the form of Arianism, right? And particularly within the Roman military and others. So really until the fall of the Roman Empire, there was still pagan practice that was part of the culture, really as long as Rome persisted. And it was really when Rome collapsed, then with it, that worship of the Greek and Roman, because the Romans had just stolen the Greek gods and renamed them, right? I mean, Romans just basically stole all of the Greek stuff. And so they didn't really invent much. And when they were, when the Roman Empire basically shriveled up and collapsed, it took a while, right? Took a few centuries, really, for Rome to really collapse. And as that happened, then the northern tribes that swept down and the intermixing, and they had already brought a whole lot of slaves into Rome. By the end of the Roman Empire, there were not a lot of Roman citizens. Like they were giving Roman citizenship to people who are not from Italy. And so a lot, especially to fight, right? In a lot of the wars, they were inscripting different, and part of the incentive was if you fought bravely, you would be given citizenship and you'd be given property. So there was a kind of melting pot that was going on in the whole Roman Empire. And so that ancient kind of Roman paganism started to die out. And so these old temples, they started to fall into disuse and disrepair. Well, the Christians are coming aboard, and so they say, well, those are some nice temples. So what you will find sometimes, if you go into like Santa Maria in Trastevere, you'll find like, you go into the church and like, if you just take a while and look at it, it's an ancient church, probably 400s, and you look at the columns going down the side and you see they don't match. Well, it's because they took them from the pagan temples. And these huge, they were not the Roman Empire anymore. The Roman Empire was on the decline. They didn't have the ability to do what they had done in the past. These huge porphyry columns. There was no way they could afford those anymore. So they just took them and repurposed them. And they did that with a lot of things. A lot of the old Roman pagan stone columns, different pieces. They just, I don't know if they sprinkled them with the holy water, or I don't know if that was the practice then, but they basically consecrated them to the service of God. I mean, you think about even, for example, the Pantheon, right? I don't know if you've been to Rome, but the Pantheon was this temple dedicated to every god. It became the Church of All Saints. So it's interesting that Christians, and we talked about this in the liturgical calendar discussion, it wasn't coming in and annihilating, right? it was like, well, okay, let's just baptize it. Right? Let's take the pagan temples and baptize it. We'll just use them for Christian stuff. We're not going to destroy it. We're not going to destroy the people. We're just going to repurpose it. You do see some Christian churches that are actually built right on the site of former temples because they had a strong foundation. So I was like, well, we're going to put the church here. St. Clement in Rome. And they found this through excavation. They actually found 3 churches. The church they found that was built in the Middle Ages, and then underneath that they found another church, and under that they found a pagan temple. So it was like three stories, three different eras. So what you start to see then is, it's interesting. In the early Middle Ages, you see, remember you had this shift though, because Constantine goes to Constantinople. And so we start getting some influence from the East. And I had not realized this until I was in northern Italy one summer, and they were like, you got to go to Ravenna. I was like, Ravenna? What's Ravenna? I've never even heard of Ravenna. They said some of the earliest Christian mosaics are in Ravenna. And sure enough, they're really quite something. So this is a classic basilica. This is the Church of Santa Sabina in Rome. So built in the 400s. St. Thomas Aquinas spent some time here. It's run by the Dominicans. You'll see it's basically a basilica is basically a central nave. It's just a box with a gable roof over it. And then you have basically passages kind of along the sides. They're aisles that they work really well because you don't have to disturb everyone to get up to the front or to move around, right? You can just kind of go up the sides and then you come in. They didn't have any pews or anything like that. And they were very simple. There's minimal windows, right? Because this is all roofed in. So you would have just, if I go back one, you can see there's not a lot of windows. There was not stained glass at that time. And we're not sure. People go back and forth as to how adorned or unadorned they were. A lot of these churches, it's interesting, in the Baroque era, they Baroqueified, which basically means throw a bunch of gold leaf everywhere. And there was a movement later to restore back to more of an original thing. So they would, like, even for example, at the Pantheon, they pulled off a lot of the Baroque because they thought, oh, that's ugly and gaudy and ugh. And let's go back to the more simple medieval original. I don't know, you can go both ways on that. But this is the basic. You have an apse in the back, right? This is the apse. Is that rounded kind of the back of the it was really designed for acoustic purposes, right? So the speaker who's standing in the apse, that apse is shaped in such a way that it amplifies your voice and sends it out into the hall, right? So you have an apse, and then you have, and sometimes somewhat elevated under the apse. So again, people can see you and hear you. And then you have these passages on each side. So that was kind of your basic, kind of your early Christian churches, after Christianity became legal. The basilica was, and it's really it's a darn good design. If I were building a church now and I didn't have a lot of money, I would be like, yeah, we're doing that. Because if you think about it, you're not spanning great distances, and it's very easy to construct. It's basically a box, but it looks nice. If you're inside, and so these old churches in Rome, they're beautiful. they're simple, but they're beautiful, and they're functional. And they've stood up for 1,500 years. That's not bad. This is the Hagia Sophia. So the Hagia Sophia was a church, in Constantinople until it was overtaken and turned into a mosque. Today, it's neither. I think it's basically the government runs it, although it's not really. It doesn't function in either capacity. I think it just basically is like a museum. I have not been to the Hagia Sophia, but it's one of the most ancient churches that has a huge span. Like, so there was nothing like this built at that time. The Romans would have been able to build things like this, but after the Roman Empire started to collapse, the ability to build things like this fell away in the West. They couldn't do it. And so Constantinople still had the resources and the ability. And this, I just want you to notice these kind of the lines. Again, you have, it's basically a kind of augmentation of the basilica style, right? Because instead of just having a straight line across the top of the columns, now you've added these arches. And then in creating along here, now the Hagia Sophia, this was really an elevated, the way, so you can see how the apse, they're like, well, let's do an apse and then put a big apse, right? And so they started adding circles on circles so that you would end up, so you have normally you'd have, in a basilica, you basically are running a big beam across with and they say, well, we'll make it more decorative, right? So they started putting columns, and then they realized we can actually even go bigger, and then we can even add more. So they start building, and you start getting, and so that's where you get the Hagia Sophia starts getting these lines. And then they were able to build this. This is a massive dome. They didn't build anything like this for another 1,000 years.
That was the biggest in the world for like 1,000 years.
Yeah. It was, I think, probably until St. Peter's. It was a long time before they could build anything like that again. So it's a pretty amazing church, or it was. What's interesting is, now if you go to Ravenna, you see anything similar? Ravenna had been, in that time, it had been actually overtaken by the East, and it came under influence from the East. And so we start to see in Ravenna, this is San Vitale, 547, very early. This is way before Middle Age. This is very early. You see these beautiful mosaics. And because they're mosaics, they have stood up. And also because there are no earthquakes there. Unlike poor Assisi, got hit with a heavy earthquake and destroyed a lot of their art. But there's beautiful mosaics in Ravenna. Here's another one of Christ the Good Shepherd. Or no, that's St. Apollinary. I don't think Jesus, but then you have all the 12 sheep. It's just it doesn't even do it justice. You have to go to see it. But it's really a beautiful, this is the apse, right? The apse mosaic. So you see this influence coming in from the East, and it starts to influence, so you get this slight changing to the basilica architecture. So this Byzantine, right, it's another way of putting it, this Byzantine influence starts to merge with the Roman, and you get this Romanesque architecture, and then we start to see churches that start to be built. Now there were towers before, but you start to get a more quintessential, you can see here, right? We start getting more of a Christian churchy look. We start to get a front facade. We have the main nave, the aisles, columns, the transept, and we're getting we have a cruciform pattern happening, right? Now, obviously, not all they were not all, like every church is different, but you start seeing more. You still have the apse, but they're getting elongated, longer churches, and eventually we start seeing the windows start becoming, because when you open this up with an arch, now you got more room for windows.
That's a good question. I noticed there was a north, west, south thing. So is the altar
Facing east was, yeah, that would have been pretty much the given for, yep. There were some churches that they weren't able to do that, but they would, like, in fact, I think, if I'm correct, St. Peter's in Rome east is not the back, it's the front. And that's part of why the altar is not on the back wall. The main altar is actually, so the priest is facing the people, so-called. He's actually facing east. Right? It was, so, this is the Durham Cathedral in Durham, England, 1093. So you can start to see how, again, we're getting these. It's Romanesque though, right? So the Romanesque is an arch that is a round arch. Gothic is when we start getting to a point, right? But so this is neo-Gothic, this church. But Romanesque would have that rounded. And you start to see some really skilled craftspeople with stone that are starting to be able to really work. There's a lot of, like, to create a church like this, you can't just do that overnight. Like, we couldn't build that now. Not easily. It would, I don't even know if we could. Financially, we couldn't. Whether we actually have the people who could do it, I don't know.
It could have been like Notre Dame, but, we couldn't do that now, but we can't. We just want to spend enough money and get the right.
You got to spend a lot of money. Yep. And unfortunately, part of it too is you can sometimes make it look the same, but the quality of the components, it's like you're using fiberglass or you're using other stuff that's not.
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, yeah.
They found the trees. So
yeah, over in France.
France,
Yeah. They did, yeah.
They did it right. It took them a long time. They spent a lot.
Well, and that's what we'll start looking at some of this. I wanted to show you this right around 900. This is gone, the Abbey of Cluny. But this is the era of monasteries, right? So remember, monasticism was really that was the primary kind of groundwork and network of society in this time period, in the early Middle Ages, especially in the West. Western monasticism boomed. The Abbey of Cluny, I think, had at one point upwards of 20,000 monks. Right? I mean, it was crazy. They owned thousands of acres. They were a powerhouse. And they were very much, if you think about, they were rooted in the Liturgy of the Hours. So a lot of there, and in the Psalms. So a lot of the artistic expression, what we have from that era, actually is manuscripts. Illuminated texts, right? The Lindsapharn Gospels, about 700. We start seeing, I can't blow it up, but it's like somebody went doodle crazy, right? And you have page after page of just meticulous illumination. You go into a lot of the churches in Europe and you'll find these huge books that are laid out under display cases, and you can just look at how each page just meticulously, I mean that's days of work on each page, right? Books like this were worth more than a house. More than a house, for sure. So there was a lot of painstaking. Book of Duro. There have been a lot that have been lost, but books became an art form, a very prized art form. One more. This is kind of a reconstruction, taking a design from the Book of Kells and updating it. It's just crazy. You want to have fun, you can look at it close up. But and what you'll see here is what I think when you look to art that is striving for the beautiful, and it's going to take its lead from nature. And so what you find is it's not rigorously uniform in the sense of much, like it looks like I mean, if you put something on an assembly line, every single one is exactly the same, right? But if you look at any given tree, all the leaves look the same, but they're not identical. Right? And that's what makes it beautiful. If they were all exactly identical, it wouldn't be beautiful. But they look the same, but they're not the same either. Right? There's this dissonance and harmony. And this is really, when you want to try and get into the mechanics of what makes something beautiful, it's this unity and diversity. That there's this balance that the creative mind is able to discover and learn from the natural world, and then to replicate and you see that I think you see that especially just the medieval, when you go through church after church after church. Just spending time in Europe, I was like, wow, this must have been such a different kind of life. Because everything is personal. Like, if you think about how many things now in our daily life, you have no idea where they came from or who made them. That was not the case with a medieval person. Everything that person touched, they knew where it came from. They probably knew the person. And so your immediate environment mediated relationship. And it also mediated creativity, because you knew that there was a person whose creative work was directly in your hands. If you were wearing clothing, you knew the person who made it. And it was like, or it belonged to your dad or your grandfather or your mom, or, it was, so these things were, it's really hard, I think, for us to even begin to really comprehend the impact of living in an industrialized landscape. And how that has, in many, many subtle ways, eroded our sense of communion and of the beautiful. Because the things that there's one act of creativity to create the original, and then that original is stamped out. Stamp, 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 stamp. I'm going to make 5 million. That's the assembly line, right? So there's one act of creativity, and then the machine becomes the mediator. So you're one step removed from the creator, the artist. Whereas in the medieval world, there was no middleman, right? There was no. You were right there with the person who, if you had a wonderful loaf of bread, it wasn't because they took it out of the freezer from the factory and popped it in the oven that morning. It was because they made it. And they probably knew the people who ground the grain, and so you were. It was just, I think it's just really hard for us to even understand how our entire perspective has shifted because of the way that we have lived in a mass-produced environment for now at least a couple centuries.
You also had, you had to work to earn your own parchment. So your own, what you were going to draw on, what you were going to write on, even back to St. Paul. He had to work to buy his parchment to write his letter to the Philippines, so to speak. So everything was really, wasn't given to you.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree. I mean, in that regard, I think, there were wealthy people still, and there was a lot of generosity in the church. St. Paul collected a lot of donations. But I think, there was still that whole human condition thing. It wasn't like people were better necessarily. I'm not saying this is like this idyllic thing of like everyone's walking around like, oh, tooraloo, raloo-ra. Life was pretty short, brutal, and difficult, and it was pretty violent, and it wasn't easy. But you were right in each other's lives. You were very interconnected in your daily existence. It's interesting, you don't hear anybody griping about loneliness in the Middle Ages. That was not a thing. Because it was like, they were all trying to get away to the monastery. They're like, please, get me out of here. Because your whole life was connected. And you think about that time, the cities in the Middle Ages, the cities, they became unsustainable, right, with the breakdown of society. So you had city-states. You didn't have large population centers. The population of Rome went down to 40,000. The time of Julius Caesar was 1 million. Right, so you had just this rapid decentralization of cities. Well, not rapid, but, and it's interesting, but they say even up until the 1800s, the Arch of Titus in Rome, which was like this huge arch that, was it Caesar? Titus, I forget who the emperor was, but when Titus came back, they had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They built this big arch in Rome to commemorate the occasion. It actually depicts them like carting off the menorahs and stuff, right? And when like in the 1800s, apparently they had somebody had put walls on either side of it, and there was a barber shop underneath it.
Really?
Yeah. This was the arch that the emperor and everybody was going through. It was and in the 1800s, it was somebody's little barbershop. So that just gives you a sense of So there was a lot that was just, we tend to have this idea that progress is this inevitable thing. I think that's just so naive. If you look at human history, George Washington moved about the same speed when he went from place to place as Julius Caesar. I mean, at the height of the Roman Empire, they had indoor plumbing, heated spas. They had food coming in from all over the world. They had the ability to deliver products and goods. It's like pretty incredible. And it all went away. Like, it was not until really the Renaissance that any of that even came back remotely. There were a few things here and there. There was certainly some cultural progress, but in terms of technology, your basic technology, it really, for the average person, was living the same way. If your average person working in the fields was living the same way in 1500 as they were living in 500 and living around the time of Jesus. If you were a farmer, your life was not really any different 1,500 years later. And we just kind of think, oh, it's just going to keep getting better. But there's nothing to guarantee that at all. Anyway, I think it's... So we had monasteries. We had some Romanesque churches. That was really... And we had some Byzantine influence. There was, as of yet, I can't really even find a lot of painting from this time. You're not going to find a lot. Maybe I need to do more research, but we have the Ravenna mosaics. You will see some mosaics. You'll see some primitive statues, but there's not, again, it's not a lot of statues. There's just not there was a real kind of flatlining of things. You probably wouldn't recognize this. This was St. Mark's Cathedral when it was first constructed in Venice in about 1000, the end of the... So we're getting more now toward the late Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, you start to see some real... the city-states in Europe start to gain some wealth. And they start to gain some ability. You start to see more concentrations of population. And so we get the great cathedral competition, right? All these little city-states decide they're going to outdo each other in building the biggest church to honor God. And so every city starts building these massive churches, like crazy. So this was constructed starting in 1063. However, it has been added to and added to and added to. This is what it looks like today. So that entire brick facade that was underneath has now been, it was given an entire, a lot of this is kind of the Baroque era, or it would have been even prior, it would have been Renaissance era. All of this embellishment was later added. And many of these buildings too, like all these facades have been added. They were not... So you see this a lot in Europe, where there's an initial facade, and then over the years, then when somebody had a lot of money. They wanted to kind of like get modern, you know. They would say, oh, everybody's doing these cool new, they got so-and-so architect to design a new facade for them. We're going to put one of those on our building too. And so you'd start to see kind of this updating of everything, and especially when the society had some money, when things were going well, right? So this is St. Mark's as it is today. Beautiful church. Another, I had showed one of the first ones. This is St. Mary of the Assumption Cathedral in Siena. I don't have enough time. I could show you slides from this church to beat the band. It's a beautiful church. And what's interesting about it is it's only about a third the size of what they wanted. When you go to visit it, there's this outdoor part, and there are these huge arches and half of a roof. And you can see that, holy moly, they were going to try and build this thing and they just never got around to it. But it was quite a project. So again, you see this is not mass produced. These are individually hand crafted, right? Every rosette, every capital. That's somebody, and this is all local stone. The black stone and the white, it's Siena. Those are the Siena shield is black and white. The Dominicans, black and white. Catherine of Siena, Dominican influence there. So Siena is a beautiful. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's really well preserved medieval city, late medieval. You can see some really beautiful things there. It looks Notre Dame, right? Looks more modern, but actually Notre Dame was started in 1163. The French were really on top of it. At that time, they were, this was cutting edge architecture. And we start to see the advent of, this is the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, Church of St. Peter. Again, you start to see these new, to do this with stone, right? So but you're starting to see these flying buttresses and spires. They're learning how to do this, and they're imitating each other, and they're competing in all these cities, copying each other. So, you get these are, what this does is distributes the weight. So it allows them to build naves that are higher and higher because they can distribute the weight out to the side walls. But, nowadays they'd be like, well, just put a tie bracket across there, bolt it on. They were like, they weren't just doing they were glorifying God. They're going to make it beautiful. Even if nobody's going to see it. How many people see this? This little part over here? Nobody sees that. It's like, even here, I've noticed, I was telling somebody, the little closet in our Guildhall office, it's like a little closet door. It's like carved oak, 2.5-inch thick door. Like with all kinds of it's just beautiful. Nobody would take that kind of time on their front door, much less a closet door anymore. But the thing is, you can't do it quickly. So you start seeing, these are all the trace work, multiple columns. Again, the apse, cruciform, towers, right? But I always quote him. I don't know where he got it. My old auto mechanic. He had a sign up in the office, and it said, "You only get to choose two of these three things: quality, fast, and cheap." And the church, and I think anybody who cares about what they're doing, has only really one option when they look at that. They say, well, I'm not compromising quality. I don't have enough money, so it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time. And so this whole idea, I think this is part of the reason why we don't do beautiful things now, is because we're like, well, we can't raise that kind of money in a 3-year capital campaign. Well, they never would have built these churches if they had to raise the resources in 3 years. Notre Dame, the rose window, that was in Bishop Barron's video. He speaks about it. Start to see just stained glass. This is actually a little earlier, Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Just crazy, right? We start seeing just we're moving now into the, you can see we're moving into high Middle Ages. They're pushing kind of even the structural limits of how narrow, how much light you can let in, how much glass you can use. Given the materials, right? This is not steel. During the same time, you start to now see some beautiful art starting to also happen. One of my favorite artists, period, is Giotto. Very restrained, but he's a very human, he just has a very human, very peaceful, I find him a very peaceful kind of depiction of life. Although this is the betrayal of Jesus. Even Jesus, when he's being betrayed, looks peaceful. But there's a kind of, so you recall, there was not a lot of, Giotto's one of the first that you start getting some three-dimensionality, right? And a little bit, you start getting more shadow and Fra Angelico would have come after and taken. Giotto was a master. Everybody looked at him. He was doing he had a whole bunch of frescoes in Assisi that when they had that earthquake, a bunch of them kind of came down in chunks. There's the famous chapel that he did in Padua. Fra Angelico, it's later, right? 1400s. And these are these huge cathedrals that are being built in all of these cities throughout Europe. Florence, now look, 200 years. To build that church. And they figured it out. Like they knew it was going to take a long time, so they build like a side. Like they'd build the side of the cross, and they'd have mass in that side of the cross. And that's what they'd be working on it the rest of it. And be like, okay. Have a good mass. You just like, it was just, because they weren't just trying to get it done, trying to put it on their resume. It was like, no, I'm building this for God. Just making something beautiful. I'm going to be doing it my whole life. Maybe won't see the end of it, but, And you can see that in the work. It's that each piece, there you have to find meaning in what you're doing in that day. Not just getting the job done. It's definitely not profit driven. It's interesting. This is the era when there were some of the strictest bans on usury. And also the guilds were the strongest in this time frame. And governments were probably the least centralized in a long time. You had really decentralization. You had a lot of competing social political forces. You had families that were very powerful. You had city-states that were powerful. You had the church that was powerful, but everybody had to kind of jockey. Nobody could really sweep the whole deck. This is the Duomo in Milan, Cathedral in Milan. It was started in 1386 and completed in 1965. They say, there's a phrase in Italy that is, when's it going to get done? Oh, when the Duomo gets done in Milan. And they say that when they got around, this thing is so complicated. I can't even show you the picture, but this is just like a piece of it. They say there's never a time when there's not staging at this church. When they finish one part, and when they get around to having completed cleaning and restoring it, they get back to where they started, they have to start again.
Why is that?
Because it just is very ornate. It's so big and complicated that it needs a lot of care. We'll take a minute for a break, and then we can get into the Renaissance a little bit. In the late Middle Ages, there started to be a discovery, and partly also through the Muslim world earlier, of the Greeks and Greek culture, and a fascination with the classical world. And so you started to see that, because they were unearthing all of these writings from the Greek philosophers, and sometimes this is overly dramatized, as if nobody knew about them. Well, if you were reading Augustine, then you knew about Plato, because so there had always, it wasn't as if there was an ignorance of everything, but there certainly it became, I would say especially became fashionable. It became fashionable to be kind of, and you see all of these in like the Roman courtyards and everything, you start to see like all of these pagan gods being depicted, and various kind of pagan cultural pieces coming back into society during the Renaissance, but also a kind of humanism Pope John Paul II talks about in his letter, where the qualities of the human form and just a studying of anatomy, and you look at a Michelangelo. We'll look at a few things, but it's just pretty incredible how they really honed the craft. So this is St. Peter's. This part in here is designed by Bramante, but the dome. No, wait. This part in here is is Michelangelo. The dome is Michelangelo's design. The front facade is Bramante. It's crazy when you think about it. You got somebody who designed something that, just to give you a sense of how massive this is. The pen that the gospel writer is holding is as tall as I am, 6 feet tall. There's a little stair. There's the railing all the way around here, and then there's a little stair going up, and then you walk along the inside of the dome, and there's another outlook here. Or it's like you're sandwiched. You're going up the dome in the stairs, and the hallway is like this. You have to brace yourself on one side. It's absolutely massive.
Is that sun rays?
Yeah, just the sun rays. But you'll notice this is not Gothic. It's very much Romanesque. Romanesque, but Baroque. So you start getting Baroque. Now, this was not all there right at the beginning. There are niches in St. Peter's they're still putting statues in. So it's each, and you could, anyway, we could spend a whole night just looking at St. Peter's. The front facade, I mean, again, it's hard to understand the scale. It's just massive. We'll come back. This is the Baldacchino designed by Bernini. We will see some other things Bernini did. What's interesting about this is the bronze from the Pantheon roof that they pulled off the pagan temple and melted down to make the Baldacchino. So Michelangelo Buonarroti. This was one of his first works, the Pietà. He was a young sculptor. I think it was when he first arrived in Rome. And across the breast of Our Lady, there's a strap, and it says Michelangelo on it. And the rest of his life, he always regretted it. Again, it's hard to. It's just. I mean, you all probably recognize it. It's such a quintessence. It's just such a. But I think he was in his 20s.
He was 23 when he made that.
Wow.
So crazy.
I mean, he was, as you read, he was really a protege. He was like just from this tall. He is just incredibly talented. And he grew, you see this with great artists. Not only was he incredibly talented, he grew up and lived in a place where that talent would be nurtured. And people recognized the talent, and they immediately pulled him in. So it was just... It's interesting that if Our Lady was to stand up, she would be like this horrific giant. Because the proportions are actually really such that... This is actually before Michelangelo, right? Donatello was one of the people that he looked to for inspiration, and actually had helped him out, brought him in. This is, I believe, this is in the Vatican Museum, this painting. Peter receiving the keys from our Lord. Just to give you these, this is just sketching It's just crazy. Sketches of Michelangelo's. And there's like pages of these things. Just his understanding of the human body. He used to do a lot of research with cadavers to understand all the musculature. And then, but mostly cadavers. This is the famous fresco on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Creation of Adam.
David.
Father Seamus, the last image, could I say, you were just talking about the anatomy. It's kind of cool because, like, if you look at the shape around God, which was controversial at the time that he depicted God, it kind of looks like a brain.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Like a human mind. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There's all kinds of, so like even the depiction of Adam being kind of weak, being depiction of humanity's dependence on God's power, right? To be able to, he can't even really lift a finger. It's like, please. I mean, it's one thing to be able to just to carve anything that looks even remotely like an eyeball out of marble, but to make marble show expression that is as complex as the expression on that face. It always drove me bonkers. When I was in Florence, all the tourist stuff that they would be selling was all just David's anatomy. They would like have every kind of thing you could imagine with David's anatomy on it. I'm like, really? Of all the things in this statue, that's what you're paying attention to? It's just lame. This is Bernini's rendition of David, which I actually really like a lot. Now I show you the Baldacchino, right? That was Bernini's creation as well. I mean, here's this crazy thing, right? So you've got somebody's capable of, like, and same with Michelangelo. You can paint, you can draw, you can sculpt, and you're an architect. I don't know how these people did that. I mean, it's like, it's pretty incredible. These were some incredibly skilled people. Just to give you a sense, this is another Bernini statue. That's marble. This is marble. Marble.
Wow. Veil marble. It actually looks like a veil too.
Yeah.
This is one of the hardest things. People can't do this anymore. Like, that's almost impossible to do.
It's amazing, yeah.
Who's the sculptor in that?
That's Bernini. Bernini was just incredible.
Oh my gosh. His generation exists in the planet? His generation exists, his
No, that's all gone, I'm afraid.
Okay.
That is all gone. I don't know that.
Yeah, I never saw that, it's amazing.
Yeah, Bernini is something else. If you go to Rome, you can actually, this statue, the Abduction of Persephone, and the, I forget which this one is, but they're both at the Galleria Borghese, and you can get like right up. And it's really, people always go to the Vatican Museum, which is a zoo. It's like hard to even think straight when you're there because it's so mobbed with people. But the Galleria Borghese, they only let 200 people in every 2 hours, and you can really take your time and really see. They have some, and I didn't have a chance to pull in the slides, but they also have a number of Caravaggios, which are really beautiful too, and some other really beautiful works. So it's definitely worth the trip if you go. So Bernini did those statues. He also designed the colonnade in front of St. Peter's. Which is supposed to look like a keyhole, right? You all know that?
Do you know why there's an obelisk in the middle of St. Peter's Square?
The obelisk was at one time located over here, where there was a big circus during the time of the apostles. And that was where Peter was crucified upside down. The obelisk is probably one of the last things he saw. It's from Egypt. When they built the new St. Peter's, they relocated it over to here. The whole history of this is on the Vatican Hill. The Vatican Hill was a cemetery where they buried St. Peter. The altar was right. The first St. Peter's Basilica was built right over his grave, and that was in place until the 1500s when they started building the new St. Peter's. And then when they built the new St. Peter's, they came in, well, even the old St. Peter's under Constantine. Constantine commissioned the first St. Peter's to be built. And they built it on the grave of St. Peter. But they came in and they basically there were all these Roman mausoleums. It was a cemetery. And they just came in and basically cut everything and just put the church right on top. And so when in the 1940s, Pope Pius XII commissioned an excavation to determine whether, because people were casting aspersions and doubt on the whole thing. And so he commissioned an investigation. They went in and excavated underneath. So they excavated down to the first St. Peter's that had been built. The new St. Peter's is the floor is about 10 feet above the old floor of the old St. Peter's. And then below that, they found the level of all the mausoleums and the old graveyards. And they actually, anyway, that's a whole thing I could get into, but it basically, they took half the hill away when the Vatican Hill, when they were constructing the church, because it's really outside. So the river, the Tiber, Rome proper was, so there's the Roman palace and everything was over here. This was considered more Rome. Across the Tiber, Trastevere, this whole area was really not considered to be Rome itself proper. It used to be, the Vatican Hill used to be like, that's where it was the cemetery in the countryside. So, there's a little, you can't really see it, but there's an urn on the top of the obelisk that has a relic of the true cross. There are 3 obelisks in Rome from Egypt that are in front of the major basilicas. St. Mary Major and St. John Lateran and St. Peter's, and I think they all have obelisks in front of them with relics of the true cross, I believe. I think. Here's an interesting, lest we get too depressed. So this is Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. They started constructing this in 1882. And they are almost done. It's supposed to be completed. It's supposed to be finished in 2026. It's it's kind of contemporary, but so they're building. I think they're building this last spire here. The inside is it's somewhat modern, but also pretty churchy. Big. Our own shrine, I think it's the largest Catholic church in the United States. The Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. That's in Washington, D.C. That was built in 1920 and actually just finally completed the whole. It was pretty much done, but they completed some of the inside different. There are all kinds of different niches, different side chapels. They just finished the last ones in 2017. So again, I think it's one of these things where people just want to get everything done like tomorrow. It's like, but part of it is you know, it's really easy. This is where I always tell people, remember when in the whole thing about Michelangelo, they said he was really persevering. You know, and I think that this is key with art. If you're creative but you can't do anything more than like for a day, you're not going to be able to do anything substantial. Like the only way you can create a beautiful anything is you have to be able to spend years, and a lot of those years you're doing like really tedious things, like just repetition. I mean, you think about Michelangelo, he was not a young man when he was painting the Sistine Chapel. And I mean, on his back, hour after hour after hour, just, you know, and a lot of it was like clothing. I mean, it wasn't like it was like, you know, nice like facial expressions and interesting things. It was like, well, here's another fold, you know, like here's another, like, this is just tedious. This is the thing about great art, is it requires an absolute ability to just persevere through complete and utter tedium. Or else you'll never make anything beautiful. It's interesting in that regard. I was just, this past Sunday, I was giving a talk for the Vespers on the virtue of fortitude. And we wouldn't necessarily think of it, but to be a good artist, you have to be incredibly courageous. Or you'll never get past go. And you'll never persevere, and the tower will never get all the way to the top. And you also think how audacious it is to, like, I mean, I can't even, some of these things, like, these sculptors would go to the mine where they were pulling these huge chunks of marble out, right? And you know these things they're worth, I don't even know what. This, was it Carrara marble? It's the white marble. So they pull these huge pieces, and you get that in the shop. I mean, that has got to be just, okay, bang, bang. I mean, you just to be able to take this huge square of marble and it requires this level of audacity and courageousness just to be, you can't be afraid. I mean, you saw some of that fine detail with Bernini's things. Like, there's no eraser with a chisel. really pretty, pretty remarkable. This is the inside of the shrine. You do get the sense though that we can't quite, and some of this is just in terms of what we are able to do right now. It's like slabs of marble that we, got somewhere, and that's what we can manage. But you're not going to see like intricate hand carved rosework stuff. You just can't really do that. You've got there are some nice mosaics there, but I don't know. It's nothing like Ravenna. It's amazing how technologically we've come a long way, but artistically, this is by no means a golden age. It certainly is not an artistic golden age. We have, as the Pope said, we need to rekindle a desire and a capacity to create beauty in our culture and in our church. We're surrounding ourselves with we have so much wealth, but it's not translated into beauty. It's just, we're healthier, our lives are easier, but they're not more beautiful.
I think that like having more like virtue in our society would kind of like affect like cultural greatness, or like inspiring beauty and like drawing out beauty to like producing more artists and that kind of thing. Because it changes architecture, it changes urban planning, just everything.
It goes both ways, right? I think there's an error sometimes. People they want everyone to be converted, and then we'll have a beautiful world. But part of it is they're already living in an ugly world, and it's a darn hard thing to be converted when your life is ugly. And I think it's been something that a number of our popes, others have been saying, is like we need to beauty reminds people of their dignity, and it helps them to aspire to be virtuous and to be good. And I think if you're surrounding yourself with spaces that make you feel like an animal, then you're going to be a lot more inclined to act like one.
Now, don't you think that the modern churches, the way they're built, a lot of them don't aspire beauty or worship because of the way?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. I don't know. I guess maybe some people would have the audacity to defend modern church architecture, but I wouldn't. Part of it is even on a practical level. They're not well constructed buildings. The designs are often just really impractical, and they start leaking the day after you build them. There was just a throwing out of wisdom. They threw out the cruciform design. Some of the very practical things. I don't want to get on a soapbox, but you look at the old designs with the aisles along the side and the transepts and now you go into a church in the round and your baby starts acting up. You're basically disrupting the entire congregation. There's nowhere to slip out quietly. And the sacristy is not anywhere near the sanctuary. So if something happens during Mass, which happens, you got to, again, disrupt the entire liturgy to walk all the way to the back of the church and try and find what you need. So they're just, I don't know. I think there was just a real there was a real casting aside and a kind of arrogance that just decided we were going to do it all better and new. And I think there's been some real, at least I don't think you see that in my generation as much. And I think even, younger people, at least the ones who are going to church, I don't see, the people who are going to church are not out there ready to go build some new concrete thing. And unfortunately, a lot of these things, they're not going to last. I mean, it's a shame because it's a waste of money, but they're just not going to stand the test of time. And that is the thing that happens, there is a certain sifting that happens just culturally. People respond to things that are beautiful. When they're not beautiful, I was in Burlington, Vermont, and they had, I don't know if I can pull it up, the cathedral they built was so ugly. And they built it in the 80s, and they've already closed it.
Wow.
This is the, let's see. Yeah, it's, let's see, I'm gonna show you the picture of it. It was like this. This is like god awful thing. It was already closed when I went down there, and yeah, here. It's like they wanted it to look like Green Mountains for Vermont. And it's like, it just looks, it's dead. It really, I mean, this is the sad thing that happens. It's so, when things are so dated, they don't. That was the cathedral. So when things are ugly, they really, I don't know. I guess you can kind of. It's kind of like what was it? I just saw the Met Gala they just had.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, it's like some of those dresses that people wear for those things. It's like, I don't know, I guess it's going to make a headline because you had to have like 15 people carry your train or I don't know, but these are things that just, they're flash in the pan. They don't have, because if you're not tapping into beauty, then beauty is eternal. So insofar as you are tying into what's beautiful, then you're grounding your work in something that will last. Insofar as it's not beautiful, well, it's going to go, you're building on sand.
I don't want to interrupt you, but about 4 or 5 years ago, the theme of the Met Gala was.
I remember that.
They were like,
That was ridiculous.
models were wearing
Miters, and they didn't even know what the heck they were doing, but it was like, that was just yeah.
That was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing that's happening. I did for some reason look at some of the pictures of it. They're not beautiful dresses. I mean, they don't bring out the beauty, of the people that are wearing them. And it's like, what are you doing? I think that this is, it's an interesting thing, right? That I think we have to, and I don't know if you find this. I find it sometimes like you decide you're going to do something well or do it beautifully, and you get pushback. People are threatened by beauty. It's like, well, who do you think you are? Why do we need to do something so fancy? Right? Kind of like, are you trying to show off? Like, we're simple people around here. We don't need to put on air. People associate beautiful things with wealth or with an entitlement, and even with the church being beautiful, sometimes there's this sense that, oh, you shouldn't put the money into that. You should. And I always say, well, look, there are a lot of people who, when they walk into this church for Mass, it's the most beautiful space they enter during the week. They cannot afford to live in a nice $1 million mansion on the coast with a master bedroom the size of this living room. They cannot afford all the luxury. The wealthy always have beauty everywhere around them. They can afford to buy it. The poor don't. And the church is for them. That's why we build it to be beautiful. And many times it's the poor who are most generous because they want the church to give them that place where they can find a beautiful space that gives them the sense of dignity, and they can say, this is my house. I helped build it. So this idea that somehow we're ostentatious or putting on airs when we're trying to do things that are beautiful and elevating, that speaks to sometimes a deep insecurity in the person who has a hard time embracing their own dignity, maybe, and what beauty calls them to. When you walk into a nice space, when you walk into a beautiful place, when you put on nice clothing, it says you have to kind of take yourself seriously and maybe act virtuously. I can tell you there is a marked difference if you bring a group of middle school students into a room that is just basically a utilitarian box. They're going to act in an entirely different way to others and to the teacher, everybody, than if they walk into a room like this. So, John Paul II wasn't just hyperbole when he said the church needs artists. We really do need to have and to put the resources and especially the time, because we're never going to have enough money. But we have to be willing to think long term. We have to be able to think. That's what I'm always saying around here. I'm like, I don't have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. It's got to be like a 50-year plan. You have to think really long term if you want to really do things well. You can't be thinking short term. And the church has, when you look at it, it's like, it's pretty amazing how, these churches, not that church, these churches in Europe, everybody goes to see them. They can't, they have to stop letting people go to Venice. It's over tourist. What do they call it? Over tourism. It's like too many tourists. They can't. It's ruining the city. Rome is just like crazy jammed with people all the time. And where do they all go? They go to the Vatican Museum, they go to St. Peter's. They go to some of the old ancient Roman ruins and things, but that's where they really want to go. Notre Dame, think about how much the secular Europe was willing to just fork over it's got to be $1 billion to restore Notre Dame. They don't, people care about the beautiful. And we need to really be attentive to it. And as Christians, as John Paul II said, we are uniquely sent to bring beauty into the world because of who we know God is and how God has made himself incarnate in the world. So I think, I've always been a little bit artistically inclined, so this is kind of my bread and butter in some ways, but there are very few things that drive me more bonkers than just people cutting corners that end up eroding, especially so if you look at this room very practically, right? This is beautiful. You don't build a ceiling this tall because it's economical, right? You don't put all the woodwork, this was built to be a beautiful space. And it was built in a particular era. And it seems to me then you need to respect the building and the craftspeople who built it and the time and the attention they put into it. Well, in the 80s, they went and threw these in. They don't go with anything. It's like, well, why did you do that? Well, I'm sure they were like, well, it would have cost 10 times as much to put a more period piece that actually matched this here. It's like that one back there. And so I think, or something, there are actually two more in the front that are also of period. But, when people say, well, that's a waste of money and, we don't want to be fancy. We're this whole thing. And I think part of it is to say, well, it's not really for you. It's not for you at all. It's for the 80 kids and their families that we had in here for their sacramental prep retreat. They weren't wealthy and they weren't entitled. And they don't get to come into a space like this very often at all. And we want it to be really nice for them when they do. And, this is why we need to be not cutting corners. And that means, I think some of it too is for a priest, we can only be out so far ahead of a congregation. If I, tell the congregation we're going to spend X amount of money on something, and the congregation is like, "What in the world? You're wasting all this money on da 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 da," because we could do it more cheaply. If cheap is always the driver, well then it has a way of tying the hands of priests, right? And I know priests who have tried to build beautiful churches and the people were just not willing to do it. So some of this, I think it's important for us as Catholics we have to be, building a culture within our own community that says, no, we really value beautiful environs. This is not just a nice if you can have it kind of thing, but it's important because, and particularly for me, this is, I guess, where I get, again, I'm going to stop after this, but where I really get on my soapbox is if people go home, and the reality is people are living in much larger, more comfortable, ornate homes than they ever did. And we're not willing to spend anything to even just maintain the church. And we're going back to these houses that are worth so much money now. and so big and rattling around in these massive houses. And then we can't even afford to take care of the house of God. So that drives me bonkers. And I don't say that from the pulpit because it's kind of this is a smaller gap. But it's like, we do need to be thinking about it and not just putting money into our private spaces. It's really important to spend money on public spaces. That's generous. That we're building things that other people can enjoy with us. It's not just our own. What are the biggest rooms now in houses? The kitchen, which is a generally private or more private, although people now have kitchen parties, I guess, cooking parties. But the kitchen and the bathrooms and the bedrooms have begun bigger and bigger and bigger. The living rooms shrunk, and entry rooms shrunk. So the houses aren't even designed to be social anymore. They're not even designed to really entertain people anymore. It's designed to just kind of coddle you and make you feel comfortable. So it's just, we're not prioritizing beautiful things, and especially the way that can bring us together. That's the thing too about all of this is beauty brings people together. It inspires people and helps foster community. People want to be together in a beautiful space. And, so I think, so we got to work on this one. This is, I think, the church, and look, John Paul II has brought it, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. It's been a clear call from the church recently. Our recent bishops, a lot of us are just saying, this is not okay. It's too ugly. Like, we need to really start to make some moves here. We need to really start prioritizing a kind of collaboration and cooperation with God to make the world that we live in more beautiful. That's important. And that's not putting on airs, and that's not being fancy, and it's not wasteful. It's dignifying. And it gives glory to God. So that's my, I'm somewhat, it's important, right? And you do, I don't know about you, but I don't know if you find this, but I think especially maybe an older generation was really, maybe they went through the Great Depression and it was just tough for them to, it was like, no, we're not, let's just keep it I think there was really a hesitance to have anything that really, to really work on something just being beautiful. And homes, I don't want to say that homes shouldn't be beautiful, but maybe there's a difference between being there's a difference between something being gold plated. What is it? Donald Trump has gold plated toilet seats or stuff like that. That doesn't make your toilet seat beautiful. Just because you gold plate it, right? Just making something out of gold you can have something very beautiful. Most of the time, it really, making something beautiful really comes down to more attention and a certain conscientiousness. But you can make very meager things very beautiful if you're paying attention. I mean, I don't know about you, but we didn't have hardly much of anything when I was young. But my mom was always very artistically inclined, and she could make things look beautiful. So, we have a couple minutes. Any kind of general thoughts about some of this? Or as I said, very brief survey of a few things. but I think hopefully somewhat just inspiring to say, yeah, let's, this is, again, you're going to be part of this whole course is to help that you're able to give a witness to our faith and to talk about and to articulate what being Catholic means and what we have to offer the world. And I think to leave out discussion of the beautiful from that would be a great impoverishment and really forgetful of so much of our tradition and so much of what we've been given.
The basilica gonna need, some more work, I don't remember.
In Lewiston?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I mean, it
every-
keeps needing work all the time.
Every destitute Memy came out with her $3,000, and that's what did it. And that's their place, that's their, what you were saying, that they don't have anything, but that's them.
Oh, yeah. They built it during the Depression. They built it during the Depression.
People still call it St. Peter's, but.
Yeah. That was where I was ordained. But, yeah, I mean, I think, but that's, I can tell you, even to this day, there are people who are like, why are you keeping that big thing? Do you know how expensive it is? They should close that. And these other churches are so much cheaper to keep, it's like, what are you talking about?
God is not cheap.
But it's like, I don't even know what to do with that. To me, it's just, it's an odd, and then you jump in your $60,000 car and drive away. Like, I'm like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing?
If you have to appreciate God, how precious you can give to God. What you can give to God. That gratitude to God, what you can't give it.
The other thing we need to really work on is helping to teach our young people and promoting schools that are and efforts that are going to teach young people the skills to be able to create beautiful things, whether it be beautiful music, beautiful art. To do, like, it's not, as you saw with a lot of you can't, many times it's not one generation. It's often you need at least 2, maybe 3 to get to the level of really skilled. It's interesting, we've had a couple of companies that have come by to look at our stained glass restoration. Well, both of the companies that came in to look at some of the really detailed stained glass restoration that we need to do here are 3rd generation. So it's the grandson of the founder who's still doing the stained glass work. Because you cannot just start your own company and become proficient at stained glass at this level in 1 generation. You can't do it. You have to have enough. You have to grow up in it.
I think too, like related to learning, like the environment that you're in, like when you're surrounded by beauty, like your mind is elevated and you're more open to like striving toward like higher waves of consciousness or like higher like elevated conversations. Like if you're in a room like this, you're gonna learn a lot better than if you're in kind of like a utilitarian box with just like all white, like public school setting, it's just learning is different. I know like in a philosophy class I took at college, we talked about this, like how you're gonna learn so much better in a classroom where you have like drapes on the windows and like crown molding or like a nice like chalkboard, like having like authentic like handmade things around you rather than just like kind of industrialized things that are gonna break in a decade or 2 that will have to be replaced again.
And the thing is that wealthy people know that. It's unfortunate, but the poor always suffer the loss of beauty first.
That's why they came out with their $3,000 they scraped together.
Yep. We were in what is that? Costco. Oh my gosh. I was poor Avery. We were buying some stuff for the parish, but she had to like put up with me on a diatribe the whole time. Because I was like, this is just, I said, I feel like cattle. It's like a warehouse should be a place that animals go. It's like, you don't even bother, there's like, here, throw a pallet of that over there. I'm like, you can't, there's just no dignity to the thing. And I just felt like, what kind of person am I if I'm so desperate for cheap that I'm going to allow myself to be treated like I'm cheap? Well, the heck with that. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going back there again. And it's barely any better at Whole Foods. I don't mean to say it's about how cheap it is or anything else. It's just this weird mentality. I think there's just a loss of self-respect and dignity where a lot of people feel uncomfortable in beautiful spaces now. If they walk into a beautiful space, they're like, oh, I don't belong here. This is too nice. I gotta be like, it's just strange, right? So we got work to do on this one. But I'll finish maybe with did I tell you the story of the rose? I told you. Did I tell you that? My mom used to tell this story about this older lady whose life was falling apart. Did I tell you about this? Her life was falling apart, and she was really in despair. And her whole house was, it was kind of like one of these hoarder things. Everything just miserable. And one day, somebody gave her a beautiful rose. Just like she'd never seen a rose. Like, it wasn't just a normal, it was like a really just perfectly beautiful rose. And she was just amazed by it. And she brought it home. And so she needed to find a vase. So she rummaged around. She finally found one of the nicer vases she found. She brought that into the sink. She washed that up. Got that all pulled together. Puts the rose in it, and it just was like really perfect. So she put it on the mantle. Well, the mantle had all kinds of clutter. So she declutters the mantle. Well, you know where this is going. She declutters the mantle. Then she starts decluttering the room. Anyway, that rose cleaned up the whole house and got her whole life straightened out. It doesn't take much beauty to leaven, right? If it is a sharing in the divine, as John Paul II said in his letter, it is not to be underestimated how far a little beauty can go, and how much it can really change people's hearts and change our whole culture. So hopefully we can work on doing our little part here at our parishes and in our homes. As I said, I am hopeful. I think people there's a lot of like talking about this kind of thing that's been happening, and I think people are recognizing that there's a need to make some efforts.